So if you were a citizen, they asked you to bring your gold to the bank and they gave you paper money. But people did it out of a patriotic, it's existential. War's not a normal market. If you lose the war, you got bigger problems than your gold. And so people put the gold in the banks. What did the banks do? They melted it down and made 400-ounce bars. And they said, don't worry, your money's backed by the gold, but keep using that paper money, but it's redeemable for gold. But oh, by the way, they're 400-ounce bars. Nobody walks around with a 400-ounce bar in her purse. I'm sure you've seen one, and I have as well. They're heavy. They weigh about 35 pounds. You don't walk around with them. So all of a sudden, the gold was still there, and the paper money was backed by gold in theory, but the gold had disappeared into the banks. That's step one. Step two, and this happened in the 1930s, the central banks took the gold from the commercial banks. So first the commercial banks took the gold from the people. Then the central banks took the gold from the commercial banks, and the Federal Reserve System told all the banks, hey, send your gold to the regional Federal Reserve Bank. And of course, most of it went to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. So now it's not even in the banks anymore, right? But you're still walking around thinking your paper money is somehow attached to gold, but people haven't seen gold for a while, unless you're a collector. Step three, the United States Treasury and the finance ministries took it from the central bank. In 1934, the United States Treasury seized the gold of the Federal Reserve System. Bearing in mind, the Federal Reserve System is privately owned. And they gave them a gold certificate. And you go to the Federal Reserve System website today and hunt around a little bit on the links and find the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and it's there. And look in the assets. And the first line item is gold certificate, and it's valued at $11 billion. But that's because they value the gold at $42 an ounce. And I've revalued it, the answer is that today's market, that $11 billion is actually worth $470 billion. So the Fed has a hidden asset of $450 odd billion that's not on the balance sheet, represented by a gold certificate. But it's not the gold. The Treasury has the gold. And by the way, where do we keep our gold? I'm talking about the United States. The Treasury owns the gold. The Fed has a paper certificate. The gold is on two Army bases, West Point and Fort Knox. So I would say the Army has the gold. Gold has gone from citizens walking around having it in your purse, to commercial banks, to central banks, to finance ministries, held on an Army base. It's still there. The gold didn't disappear, but nobody talks about it, and everyone pretends it's not money. But of course it's money. But meanwhile, what's happened to the civilian population, the citizens? We stopped talking about it. We stopped saying it. We stopped learning about it. I remind people, just showing my age, but I got a graduate degree in international economics, and I was class of 74. But that was the year the IMF demonetized gold. But I was the last class that was taught gold in an academic setting as a monetary asset. If you're younger than I am and you know anything about gold, you're either self-taught or you went to mining college, because they just stopped teaching it. So now we have two generations of scholars who never learned a thing about gold. So they hid it, they took it, they buried it, they stopped teaching it, they stopped talking about it, and they pretended it's not there. Meanwhile, it is there. And Russia is a good example of someone who takes it seriously. In the US, we still have our 8,000 tons, 8,133 tons. We haven't given it away. We haven't sold any gold since 1980, by the way. We got the British to do it. We got everyone else to do our dirty work. The British sold more than half, the British sold more than half their gold. The Swiss sold 1,000 tons. The IMF sold 400 tons in 2010. That was the last significant sale by a monetary institution. Australia sold most of theirs. Canada sold most of theirs. If I were one of these other countries, I would say to the US, hey, why don't you sell some of your gold? But the US doesn't. We haven't sold it an ounce since 1980. It's just at a very high level. I would say that there are a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges. We'll talk about all of them in detail. People put words in your mouth and kind of get the reputation as this doom and gloom guy. Rickards is always talking about the end of the world, which I don't. I never use that expression. But I make the point that, despite the difficulties, we don't have to be victims. We're not helpless. We don't have to curl up in a ball. The key is to see it coming. If you can see things coming, you can deal with them accordingly. You can get through them, not only preserve wealth, but actually make money. I always point out the example of Hugo Stinnes, and people go, who's that? He was an industrialist in Weimar, Germany in the early 1920s. And he could see the hyperinflation coming long before the middle class, long before anybody else. He went out and borrowed an enormous amount of Reichsmarks, that was the currency at the time, and just bought industrial assets, coal mines, vessels, natural resources, etc. So here comes the hyperinflation. He gives it a little time. He pays back his debts. I would say pennies on the dollar, like a millionth of a penny on the dollar, in other words. But he paid it back. They were sweeping the money down the sewers, but he paid back his debts and kept all the assets. And he became the richest man in Germany. And my German's not very good, but his nickname was the Inflationskönig, which means the inflation king. So there are other stories like it, Joseph Kennedy in the 1929 crash. But here's a guy who lived through the greatest hyperinflation of any modern industrial economy and ended up as the richest man in Germany because he saw it coming and made the right move. So again, we're not helpless. We can do things about it. But the key to empowerment, as I say, is to see it coming. That's where the analysis comes in. And you're like, Jim, are you smarter than everybody else? Of course not. There are a lot of big brains around, but people have flawed models. There's a lot of behavioral psychology behind it, the confirmation bias or believing the future will resemble the past, which it usually does not. And so if you're going to stick to those models, you're going to get really bad results. It's hard to think of an institution that has a worse forecasting record than the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Federal Reserve, with the possible exception of the IMF. They're both pretty bad. I mean, you could almost take the Fed forecast, do the opposite, and be just fine. There's more to it than that, but they just stick to these really bad models. But if you understand how the economy really works, if you understand it's a complex dynamic system, all I've done is I've taken complexity theory, which has been around for a while. I mean, you could say 13 billion years because the Big Bang was the ultimate complex dynamic paradigm shift or phase transition. But the science of complexity, understood in mathematical terms, really dates to the kind of the early 60s. But it's been used very successfully in physics. It has a lot of applications. All I did was bring it over to capital markets. I looked at capital markets and said, wait a second, here's one of the most complex dynamic systems you can picture. And then there's nothing more complex than the human brain. So you're putting humans on top of capital markets. You've got complexity squared or some exponent. And those models work brilliantly. But try getting anyone to understand it or do that work is difficult. But again, the point is, if you have the right models, and I would include behavioral psychology, a good dose of history, complexity theory, and a few other branches of applied mathematics, you can get very good results. But if you stick to, the Phillips curve and non-accelerating inflation, unemployment rate, and a lot of other nonsense the Fed uses, you're gonna get it wrong. Does the future resemble the past? With some probability, some degree of distribution probability. Not always. I mean, and maybe less frequently now than ever. And they also assume that prices move continuously. Prices go up and down, of course, but markets don't move continuously. Or if they do, it's when you don't care. When you do care, they just gap. They gap down or they gap up. You miss it, you blink, and it's at a completely different level. It's been repriced. Now, you can still get in and out, but you've either made a lot of money or lost a lot of money, in the blink of an eye. So when you take those characteristics, and this is how I started kind of, deconstructing it, if you will, and say, well, look, markets are not efficient. That's nonsense. They don't move continuously and slowly. They gap up and they gap down. And if you're not ready for that, you've missed the boat. Nothing's risk-free. So why don't we start there? When I started identifying those factors that, in my view, were incorrectly applied, and you say, well, what looks like that? Well, the answer is a complex dynamic system. A system that produces hurricanes and tornadoes and lightning bolts and power outages and earthquakes and tsunamis. Those are all examples of the results of complex dynamic systems. An earthquake doesn't sneak up on you. It just the ground falls out from under you instantly. And that's what happens in markets. So then I said, well, maybe that's a better model. Of course, it is. Things evolve all the time. Another tool, intellectual tool, applied mathematical tool, uses Bayes' theorem without getting too much in the weeds. And I learned Bayes' theorem at the CIA because I always say, if you have all the facts, a smart high school kid can solve the problem. The intelligence agencies and others, and people in capital markets, have to solve problems when you don't have all the facts. But you have no choice. In national security or defense, it's literally life or death. On Wall Street, it could be your fortune or your client's fortune. So you don't have the luxury of just throwing up your hands and say, well, I'm going to wait till I get more facts. That's what Janet Yellen did, but that doesn't work in the real world. She's kind of detached from that.